so on and so on. And 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 so on and so on.
Yes, well, to begin with, thank you both for having me back on the podcast. My previous visits were a lot of fun, and I know that this one will be too. So it's a real honor to be here.
So for any new listeners wanting to get a grip on Adrian's intellectual background, a wider project that he's been working on in tandem with figures like Slavoj Žižek, Lorenzo Chiesa, Catherine Malibu, etc., 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 they can go back and listen to our Žižek's ontology episode and the second episode, Žižek and Quantum Physics, from July last year.
And I love this because what you guys are doing is helping make theory accessible to people outside the academy. And that is such important work. You know, I mean, this is part of the labor of what Gramsci talked about as the, war of position being waged by the intelligentsia. And we need to do this kind of work. And so I'm really glad that, you're bringing out so much content, and I've jumped in and listened to different episodes, and yeah, it's great stuff. So, thank you both for helping to make this, like Žižek's work and other people are involved, with these ideas and these traditions, for, helping really disseminate this, which, I think is really, really, really important.
And so on and so on.
All right, well, let's begin then in perhaps a surprising place, Adrian, by plumbing the depths of psychoanalytic Marxism and starting our conversation in the toilet. You say in your book, Infinite Greed, that the capitalist socioeconomic system in its entirety thus resembles a person who shoves his own head up his own ass precisely in order to eat his own shit, or a snake that swallows its own tail specifically so as to consume its own feces. Now, I'm reminded of the likely facetious news story about the Japanese shitburger. Do you remember this?
No, I do not. Go ahead.
So the story goes back at least to 2011 with a Japanese scientist, Mitsuyuki Ikeda from the Okayama laboratory, where he managed to turn raw sewage into a protein-rich creation that resembles beef in texture and, by the time that the scientists have finished with it, also in taste and smell, wherein they wanted to show that what comes out of the body can be recycled to go back into the body. So here we have this snake-like figure of the Ouroboros, and suggesting to you we have the MCM as mouth, copro mouth. As you put it, capitalism must eat. Perhaps the capitalist motto would then be better fed than read. Would you be able to go through what you were doing in this section of the conflicted political animal, the plumbing of political economy, Marxism and psychoanalysis down the toilet?
In terms of the portion of Infinite Greed you were asking about, this would be the final section of the first full chapter. And the 4 sections leading up to that fifth and final section of chapter 1 attempt to work through both Freud's own criticisms of what Freud took to be the Marxist tradition, particularly, in terms of what Freud was observing going on nearby in revolutionary Russia. So the later Freud, who sees fit to periodically comment upon Marxist theory and connection, especially with the Bolshevik Revolution. So to work through those, concerns, reservations, criticisms of Marxism coming from Freud, and then reciprocally to look at the Marxist critiques of Freud of various sorts, and to deal with those. And so what precedes the portion, the final section of chapter 1 you're asking about, is a kind of clearing of the ground, an attempt to, as it were, address the mutual misunderstandings between Freud, at least, and more classical Freudianism on the one hand, and certain versions of Marxism contemporaneous with and coming after Freud. But then I turn to, the topic of toilets, in part, inspired by Žižek's, both humorous, but at the same time, very serious and insightful observations about European toilet design in relation to Marxism and the Marxist critique of political economy. And just to make sure that our listeners are on the same page with us, but as you two already know, of course, Zizek points out that the very European spiritual trinity that Hegel and Marx identify as sort of the core of you might say, European Geist itself, namely British economics, French politics, and German philosophy. Zizek, of course, taking this Hegelian Marxian European triad of Britain, France, and Germany, of course, points out that this spiritual triad also shows up in three distinct lavatory designs. That you have, the German toilet, which in line with the German focus on high culture as philosophy, serious art, etc., involves a very meditative, contemplative stance. And so you have the German toilets, and it's true, I've had to use these toilets in Germany many times. The shelf out in front so that you can sit there and literally gaze upon and scrutinize your own excrement in order to read the tea leaves of your health, etc. So you got the German toilet design. The French one, which Zizek then contrasts as the opposite, right? German philosophical ruminating versus French radical revolutionary political haste. That, as Zizek puts it, the French want the shit to disappear as soon as possible. So it just goes down into the hole in the back of the toilet. You don't see it. That's it. You immediately get rid of it. And then, of course, the British toilet design as the Anglo-Saxon utilitarian pragmatic compromise, where, well, the excrement can float in the waters. So if you want to look at it, you can, but at the same time, you could flush it down quickly so that you can, and and what Zizek wants to point out is that the apparent pragmatic one, where we could say, oh, it's just about the use value of being a toilet that's concerned. What is the most efficient or effective design? It's clearly not a matter of that, because all three toilets are equally good at doing what a toilet is supposed to do ultimately, which is to send your waste matter into the sewer system. And the apparently pragmatic one is itself, in Zizek's view, a secondary sort of compromise between, the two designs of the German and French toilets, which what you see reflected in the shiny porcelain there are aspects of a general, social formation of an entire, you might say, cultural historical ethos, right? That, it seems a little difficult to dismiss as a coincidence that these national characters have toilets that really do seem to reflect aspects of what we associate precisely with those national cultural identities or ethoi. And so Zizek wants to point out that we can see aspects of what Marx would call a kind of social formation involving both an economy and then more than economic forms of life corresponding to that mode of production, reflected in even these most mundane material objects that are part of not infrastructure in Marx's technical sense, but infrastructure in terms of just the most basic apparatuses for our shared, safe, communal, social living, including things like toilets and sewage systems in addition, and that it shows up even at this very concrete level. And I think that's, although we might laugh about it, Zizek is dead serious that this really indicates the permeation, the manner in which, in line with, I would say, something like Althusser's idea of overdetermination in Marxism, like the entire, complex social whole of the totality formed by a conjoined infrastructure and superstructure end up converging upon and overdetermining even such mundane, specific, determinate objects in our daily lives as the toilets in our bathrooms. And so that, was kind of an inspiration. And when I went back to Lacan, I found that the place that I think Zizek has in mind, but never cites directly himself, is that in 1967, Lacan was giving a talk to a group of psychiatrists in training. And at one point in this talk, Lacan says, well, I've really been puzzled by the fact that there's no manual of political economy, no work of classical economics that ever talks about the human business of waste disposal. And then Lacan talks about how, well, actually, you don't realize it. And he says, in very, very analytic fashion, political economists, we all experience a certain embarrassment or awkwardness about our own shit. And so, this, well-rehearsed social revulsion to the anus and what comes out of it, ends up creating this blind spot in the discourse of political economy that also for psychoanalysis has a lot to do with libidinal economy, as would obviously be the case here. And, obviously Freud talking about the link between money and feces, about the anal drive, et cetera, also gets woven into what I'm doing in this part of the chapter, the first chapter of Infinite Greed. But what I want to do is I take Lacan saying that really we have to think about solid waste not only in libidinal economic terms, but in political economic terms, and the manner in which the whole industry of solid waste disposal, which now, of course, is also merging with things that are going on at the level of the so-called, I wouldn't call it a revolution, but we often talk about, or green transition, or these gradual ecological changes, which is where we come back to the Japanese shit burger, right? Where it's like, all right, now we have the chance to even be able to squeeze some surplus value out of literal shit, right? I mean, it's really something else, but of course, what really I had in mind is like looking at Marx's formula, his general formula for capital, as he calls it, the basic fundamental logic animating those individuals who are bearers or personifications of the function of capital in the capitalist socioeconomic system. That the logic, of course, is MCM prime, money, commodity, more money, the prime indicating the additional amount. And that this is not just a linear sequence where once you get to M prime, you stop, right? Of course, you reinvest, that additional amount, most of, the surplus value that the capitalist takes his or her share of as profit doesn't get spent on personal consumption, but gets reinvested. And you have this constant looping, this perpetual motion merry-go-round that throws off ever more surplus value. And this, of course, is the logic of capitalist accumulation and perpetuity. But, the idea, it was that, well, if you think about this in terms of Freud's anal drive, it's more like the capitalists are anal expulsive, and they put all this shit out there in the guise of commodities, including even literal shit burgers. And then right, what they recoup from that, they then plow into making more shit burgers to be sent out to make more money, to make more shit burgers, and corresponding to the capitalist anal expulsive tendency, is then echoing this, and we who are not capitalists but who are consumers, although capitalists also sometimes function as consumers, but the bulk of us who aren't capitalists, we tend to relate to capital secondarily in the mode of consumers, and that we are led to, in conjunction with the capitalist purging, this expulsion, this sending out into circulation money and commodities to generate more money as surplus value, that we correspondingly as consumers then end up binging on this increasing amount. We start, pounding shit burgers at an ever accelerating rate. And of course, that is just us doing our role, helping to sustain the process of capital accumulation that we don't benefit directly from, but that, of course, those who are capitalists are, that's their fundamental, motivation. And it's, and so Lacan even talks about how basically things like the recycling industry that he talks about is connected to the solid waste disposal business will become increasingly important parts of capitalism. And this Lacan in 1967 could be credited with predicting the shit burger. Really, I'm not joking. Not in so many words, but if you go back and look at this passage, it's in his lecture, My Teaching. And that, is really, and I quote it in the book, it's quite striking, but it's a matter of, really seeing how at the level of things like our toilets, just basic consumables, et cetera, it's almost as though, we're caught in this circuit that I also describe, shifting from the anal to the oral register psychoanalytically as kind of a reverse bulimia, where instead of first, the binging, then the purging. The capitalists initiate things with first the purging in the sense of the expulsion, the sending out into circulation of money functioning as capital, which then also results in, commodities, et cetera. And then, so first you have the purging, and then, secondarily the binging, like what the capitalists vomit out, we eat up, and on the process goes. So consuming our own waste products, whether shit, vomit, et cetera, seems to be very much part of the disgusting coprophagic looping of a social order that is run by this circular, repetitious MCM prime circuit as its fundamental underlying logic, if Marx is right.
What you've touched on there relates to a section later on, I think, in the book around the two types of commodity fetishism.
Yes.
Where the capitalist and the consumer are seized by different forms of commodity fetishism. And so we want you to just tease that out a bit more. But just in addition to that, I guess, is when I was reading that section, it reminded me of the Japanese philosopher Kochin Karatani and his trans critique. And to oversimplify it, like he has a bit in there where he talks about the important shift in workers from being the labor power commodity to being money en masse that buys commodities. And one of the implications, I guess, he draws from this, to quote him, he says, a consumer's boycott is the most dreadful thing that capital can imagine. So given your take on the two types of commodity fetishism, and in particular the point that consumerist commodity fetishism is a symptom of this underlying capitalist commodity fetishism. Expanding on these two types, if you could also just touch on whether or not a consumer boycott is the most dreadful thing that capital can imagine.
Well, it's certainly one thing that the capital would find upsetting, but the truth is, right? I mean, this is one of the odd things about capital and capitalism. I think that for so many of us, at least a good number of people that I've talked to, and certain things that I've read as well, we seem when it comes to dealing with capitalism, and here it's also appropriate, with the Karatani reference, since as you both know, it's Karatani's work from which Zizek gets his idea of parallax, right? That there's another parallax when it comes to our positioning vis-a-vis capitalism, which is that on the one hand, it appears to be this, invincible monstrosity that is able to survive all of these various crises, including its own self-generated crises, and to do so well that even many Marxists, of course, are led to say, well, Marx was much too, optimistic, way too sanguine about the prospects of capitalism eventually destroying itself. And its contradictions, bringing about its own self-wrought ruin. And maybe, in fact, it somehow or other is able to survive all of these, or even, that its crises, in fact, make it stronger rather than weaker, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, it seems invincible, but on the other hand, and this is where I think some of Karatani's work comes into play very nicely. On the other hand, it can seem incredibly fragile, vulnerable, et cetera, right? And right at the moment of where it seems to have reached a point in history of this global triumph in terms of, the Anthropocene is also capitalist globalization and the complete capture of the planet. At that point, at the same time, just as it seems strongest in having reached this point of development, it also seems weakest now that it's threatened with everything from environmental catastrophes, new viruses like the coronavirus. I mean, of course, we were staring at the possibility of at least certain capitalist economies, teetering or collapsing for various reasons under that duress. In addition, and linked to the coronavirus, we also realize with all of these highly distributed across the world supply chains, that there's also incredible vulnerability at that level. And then someone like Karatani also points out that, look, I mean, of course, Marx emphasized, most famously in the transition from part one to the subsequent parts of Capital Volume 1, look, you cannot explain capitalism if you focus on the sphere of exchange, which after Marx, mainstream economics went on to continue trying to do. no, you need, a modified version instead of the labor theory of value, a la Smith and Ricardo. And this involves looking at, all right, you want to know where capitalist profit comes from. It can't actually be accounted for in the exchange sphere. You have to leave the noisy public marketplace and go into the sordid, secret abode of production, the factory, et cetera. And where the quote unquote profit comes from is, of course, the unpaid surplus labor time of your commodified labor power that shows up in the guise of surplus value appropriated by the owner of the means of production. That's all standard Marxism. But of course, Marx at the same time, and especially starting in volume 2, points out that nonetheless, the entire circuit that capital has to traverse in order to generate a surplus value, and then for that surplus value to come back in a portion of it in the guise of profit in the pocket of the capitalist, does involve all of these networks of social relations, including in the sphere of exchange. And at any point along the line, if something holds things up or throws them off the rails or blocks, any point in that movement, that's a problem for capital. That can generate a crisis, right? And so, yeah, Karatani is right. Like a sort of a consumer exchange sphere version of the old idea of the general or mass strike, right? Something like that. And I think, something like that would have potential. But then, of course, the question is, and this is where you come up against a version of something that resembles the classical, problem of class consciousness in the Marxist tradition. How do you convince a critical mass of consumers to go on strike, right? And, I don't pretend I have, I'm not saying like, this is a huge fault of Karatani's. I don't think any of us have the magic bullet hidden away in our back pocket in terms of what will finally put an end to capitalism. But there, I think, are various ways it could come about. And I do think that, and of course, there are crises of what economists call effective demand. In other words, consumers who need and want stuff, but their demand isn't effective because they don't have money to pay for it, right? And there have been various versions of that. I mean, I think that's part of why even some mainstream pro-capitalist politicians in various countries now are willing to at least countenance talk of something like a universal basic income, et cetera, right? And all of these things can be seen. So I've talked about volumes 1 and 2 of Capital. Volume 3 of Capital, right? Marx's famous and controversial arguments about the long-term tendency of the rate of profit to fall in capitalism. And part of what, for Marx that has to do with is that capitalists are forced to, in competition with each other, to constantly engage in techno-scientific modernization in order to stay competitive, to continue making profits. But in the long run, that's detrimental to them because, of course, the very source for their profit is surplus value, which is the unpaid labor time of commodified labor power. And the more you automate, technologize, et cetera, the less laborers you need, the less, the less pumps you have to squeeze surplus value out of. And, for Marx, there are various ways capital will try to fend off this long-term tendency. And I think we're seeing some of those pop up now. But one way to certainly precipitate a crisis would be to introduce problems in the sphere of exchange, which would be what would happen if you had a Karatani style, consumer boycott. So, yeah, but I'm very open to, it's like a version of Mao's Let 100 Flowers Bloom. There are many points of vulnerability. Whatever one ends up working, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Marx identifies for those of us in capitalism 2 basic logics that we can obey. If you are a part of that tiny minority that, and you're an owner of the means of production or the possessor of a critical mass of money that could function as finance capital, you can and do function as a capitalist. And in that case, you obey this general formula, MCM prime. But then for consumers, and especially for those consumers who are also workers, as opposed to when the members of the bourgeoisie go shopping for themselves and their family, that the rest of us obey a logic that is really the inverse of this, which Marx spells out as CMC prime. That initial C, right, is really the only resource most of us have, which is our commodified labor power. And so I have this one commodity, which is the particular type of, however skilled and whatever type of skilled labor I have my labor power. It is a commodity, and the label that's like the label on the soup can for this commodity would be something like my CV or my resume. I put myself up on a certain exchange market, what we call job markets. And if I'm successful, I get hired, whether as an hourly wage laborer or even as an annual salaried employee. But in both cases, I exchange my C, my commodified labor power, for M, money in the guise of wages or salary. And that money represents the cost of my means of subsistence at a material level of quality of life that society considers to be appropriate for someone in my station in the division of labor. And then I take that money and I go to other marketplaces, not job markets, but places like the supermarket, and I exchange that for commodities other than my labor power, like soup, food, clothing, shelter, et cetera, right? One thing that I'm trying to do in the book is to say, when we talk about selfishness in debates about Marxism, we have to be very careful here because there's some disambiguating that is requisite. And for Marx especially, given this distinction between the logic of capital as MCM prime and the logic of just consumptive activity on the part of the laborers who sell their labor power to capitalists as CMC prime, that the kind of, you might say, fetishism of commodities that you get at the level of consumers is oriented usually towards specific determinate entities, specific thieves, right? These commodities, I want this car, I want that type of food, I want this make of clothing, et cetera, right? So you have very much this relationship to determinate objects, and there's much more of a sense of part of what it's about, at least, is the use value of the commodity in question, like what its material qualities are, what kind of specific satisfaction or gratification it provides, and that you could call the fetishism of commodities at the level of the logic of the consumer. Selfishness and the fetishization of certain things, a la Marx's account of commodity fetishism, you could say that consumer selfishness is where what I want to do is indulge myself in particular forms of contentment or titillation that have to do with specific commodified objects or experiences. Again, I want to eat at this restaurant, I want to drive that car, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas with capitalists, their selfishness in terms of their fetishization of what it is they're after, to really oversimplify here, that has to do with not achieving some finite endpoint in the guise of a consumable use value that produces something that provides you with a private sense of enjoyment, pleasure, satisfaction, gratification, et cetera. Instead, of course, what the capitalist is all about is not, okay, I just want to, as Marx puts it, amass as much, wine, fine clothes, fancy baubles, et cetera, as I can. That's not what motivates capitalists. If it were, they would stop being capitalists pretty early in their careers once they'd made their first billion. Even there, you can't spend it all in one lifetime. But they keep going compulsively, right? And it's because their greed, as the title of the book had, is infinite rather than finite, right? What we normally think of as first-person selfishness in the guise of, greed as avariciousness, acquisitiveness, et cetera, we tend to think of in a way that's modeled on our consumptive activity. Right? I just want to consume more than my neighbors and consume things of higher quality that, give me a, greater amount of social standing, et cetera, keeping up with the Joneses or all that nonsense. And that's one kind of selfishness. And I think when people object to Marxism and say, oh, well, human beings, are inherently selfish, and that's why you can't put an end to capitalism, they think that that kind of selfishness is also what's driving the capitalists. But Marx's account says, no, that, finite human greed is not what is really running the show. It is instead this inhuman, infinite greed, which is just this, because of its purely quantitative nature, this mathematical exchange value, surplus value centered drive of MCM prime, as it were. It has no stopping point, right? And that for the capitalists, there's no such thing as reaching a point at which you say, enough. Right? I've accumulated a satisfactory amount. You can always make more. And that's the imperative, right? That the logic of capital demands it. And once you stop doing that, you immediately are put out of business by your competitors, right? And so, the invisible hand of the marketplace is also this whip hand that, through competition enforces this compulsively repeated cycling through the loop of MCM prime with there's literally no end to it, right? No stopping point, no point of satiety, satisfaction, etc. And that's extremely different. And since that's the selfishness that runs the show, insofar as that's the logic of capital at the heart of capitalism, capitalism is not a result of particular wealthy individuals having excessive appetites for personal consumption. And that's like the biggest take-home point that I'm trying to drive home in terms of aligning in the discussion of fetishism between Marxism and psychoanalysis, drawing a distinction between two different types of commodity fetishism, reflecting the difference that Marx spells out between MCM prime and CMC prime.
Yeah, because in that section, I was reminded of that well-known Schopenhauer quote, Adrian, the money is human happiness in the abstract. And so the man who is no longer capable of enjoying such happiness in the concrete sets his whole heart on money. Because there is that ambiguity, right, where it struck me that within the logic of capital, this abstract wealth is exactly where capitalist enjoyment's produced. So it's where money as such comes in to stand for value. It functions as that universal equivalent, right? So with that in mind, can you speak a little on what's at stake in this Lacanian recasting of capitalism centered on jouissance rather than pleasure, right? So Marxist enjoyment corresponds to Lacanian pleasure, and Marxian enrichment corresponds to Lacanian enjoyment.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and it's even like German language, Lacanian literature uses the German word Genuss for jouissance. But when Marx uses Genuss, he means it as enjoyment in the non-Lacanian sense, just as a synonym for pleasure in terms of the gratification you get from consuming certain types of use values. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, enrichment is, as you point out, yes, that is Marx's term for this open-ended, in principle, infinite accumulation that the very logic of capital is organized around, that it is the pursuit of indefinitely. And I think here the best place for me to begin would be, and with Zizek too, I mean, he and I had a chance to talk quite a bit about this book when it was in manuscript form. The past few years I've been over in Ljubljana multiple times each year, and we'd shared some material with each other, and we were talking about this. And one of his formulations, I think, nicely captures what happens in terms of the distinctiveness of capital as a mode of production, but now viewed in libidinal as opposed to political economic terms. And that with the emergence of the logic of capital, you have suddenly, instead of the accumulation of pleasures, which would be like consumerist commodity fetishism, you instead have the pleasure of accumulation, which would be where the simple, endless increase of the quantitative amount of monetary wealth one has in the guise of wealth generated specifically through capitalist production as accrued surplus value expropriated from the producers of that surplus value, the workers, here, in a way, I can link it to jouissance, because I would want to say that it's not only that you go from the accumulation of pleasure to the pleasure of accumulation, but that pleasure becomes, in a way, too much, and hence becomes something more like Lacan's jouissance as, pleasure beyond the pleasure principle is one way one could formulate it that's close to, especially, I'd say, some of Lacan's formulations apropos jouissance in a text like Seminar 7. But, and why I say this is that it's clear that a lot of this is very unpleasurable at the first person level for the agents, again, what Marx calls the bearers or personifications of capital, for individual capitalists themselves. We have to, and Marxism, of course, is not a kind of good guys versus bad guys cartoonish conspiracy theory that depicts capitalists as C. Montgomery Burns, right? As these literally like caricatured supervillains, they're with top hats and monocles and twisting their handlebar mustaches, rubbing their hands together, and now we're going to screw over the proletariat, right? Marx, obviously is not theorizing it this way, and you certainly see it. There are plenty of capitalists who themselves will say things such as, all right, it breaks my heart. And I don't, and like I saw, for instance, on this documentary from years ago, The Corporation from the early 2000s, and, the CEO of BP was being interviewed. And he was clearly, just at a first person psychological level, as a flesh and blood individual, seemed very agreeable, affable, not at all villainous, nothing, nothing of the Mr. Burns about him, et cetera, to use again that Simpsons reference. He was talking about outsourcing, and he was saying it absolutely breaks my heart to hand out pink slips to all of these workers here in this country who been with us for years and who we owe so much to, and I have to throw them out of work and relocate their jobs, the factories, et cetera, overseas to where labor is cheaper. And I don't want to do this, but if I don't do this now, my competitors are going to are going to get a lead on me doing it. And again, it's like it could be a situation where nobody's done it yet, but there's a rush to pull the trigger, even if you don't want to, because whoever does so first gains a competitive edge, et cetera. And if you want to stay in the capitalist game, you've got to do that. And so the invisible hand, right? Marx even talks about how there's at least objective alienation for the biggest of the big bourgeoisie. They don't feel alienated. They don't feel disempowered. They feel like, say, Wall Street bankers, they feel like they're masters of the universe, but they too are alienated. They too have allowed themselves to become the puppets or playthings of what isn't just a metaphor in Smith. The invisible hand is abstract yet palpably real, and it forces them to do all these things if they want to stay in the business of perpetual accumulation of ever more surplus value. And so, it's like this guy who's an ordinary, not at all psychopathic, likable, individual human being who happens to be the CEO of BP finds himself effectively, in terms of the social consequences of his conduct, having to behave like a ruthless, psychopathic, profit at all costs agent, simply because if he doesn't, the very logic of capital will result in him ceasing to be a capitalist, getting, as it were, thrown out of the loop of, the circuit of capital's, self-reproduction through self-accumulation through enrichment. And so, this idea of being compelled to do things that you even find painful, upsetting, distasteful, et cetera, or like, I know we're despoiling the environment, I know we're creating unemployment here, et cetera, but what can I do, right? Market forces are what they are, right? And we've got to stay in business. And so that's where you start getting closer to something like, a kind of compulsion, and a subtle, invisible compulsion that forces you to do things you don't desire to do, but that yet you keep finding yourself doing. This is where we're getting into the territory of some of the phenomena that Lacan has in view when he's using a concept like jouissance at certain moments.
Yeah, it's like the invisible hand of the market that rocks the cradle rules the world.
Yes. Bingo. Yep. And it gets us very early, right? These tentacles of our economically conditioned social life under capitalism are, already shaping, your family of origin, are already, you're of course born into, various conditions, including a certain class position, et cetera. All of this, it takes hold very early on. And and psychoanalysis, with its notion of prolonged prematurational helplessness, in terms of our, particularly drawn out susceptibility to being molded and mediated by our surroundings, makes it such that in a capitalist society, we're captured by all of this very early on. And so it kind of beds down, in some foundational levels and layers of our being, including certain components of our libidinal economies that does, I think, affect you might say, our motivational structures, such that, there is something distinctive about being a subject of capitalism in terms of its libidinal consequences.
Yeah, just while we're on this, so again, this distinction between the two types of commodity fetishism, the capitalist as capitalist, capitalist consumer. You also, I guess, deploy this in another way that really challenges our everyday sensibilities, in the sense that we think of capitalists as selfish and socialism and communism as selfless, I guess. And you really kind of turn that on its head. So I was wondering if you could just explain a bit more about this. And again, I'm doing this to you again with a kind of follow-up, because you say that Marx's drive theory is transhistorical, mediated by the different social formations, historical social formations. So what would this transhistorical drive look like mediated by communism?
Yeah, and by the way, with that slip there, you're in good Lacanian company, since Lacan likes to play on history and hysteria, history, Hystory. Anyhow. Well, let me start with, just a few kind of concrete facts and examples to sort of flesh this out. So to begin with, right, if we look at, and I of course, early on in the book, in fact, in the opening pages of the preface, I draw attention to this. Well, if you look at current global wealth statistics, and like, for instance, I drew on the most recent global wealth report from Credit Suisse. And, of course, Swiss bankers can't be accused of being even closet Marxists, I think, so it's not like I'm drawing on, I'm just, okay, I'll just use statistics for global wealth that, have been put together by, people with, similar political views to myself. No, I mean, even people, who are pro-capitalist, are, acknowledge that, well, we do have this, rapidly increasing and shockingly gaping, divide of wealth inequality that is, accelerating, so much so that you have some on the left, now talking about, well, perhaps we're leaving capitalism behind and entering into an age of neo-feudalism, given how extreme these wealth inequalities are, et cetera. Maybe we'll come back to that in a bit, maybe not, we'll see. But for now, what I would point out is that, okay, even by the admission of the apologists for capital themselves, apart from people like Thomas Piketty on the left, et cetera, it's very clear that we have massive, massive wealth inequality, and that the vast bulk of the world's population lives in penury. Right. And even, and like within the US too. I mean, when I remember in 2014, reading Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century and looking all the stats and, being shocked that, as a humanities professor at a public university, I'm like in the top 10% of household incomes in the US. It's shocking, right? And then, thinking, all right, it's pretty hard to I've got private school I have to pay for my kids, and I've got these other, their college expenses, and it's a lot, and how are we going to juggle this? And then realizing, my God, right? And I'm supposedly in a comparatively extremely privileged position, right? So, this just at a first person level even, and then looking at the global stats, from groups like Credit Suisse or Piketty studies, et cetera. It's like, okay, capitalism, which supposedly, raises the material quality of life for all of us, clearly is failing to do that. And failing to do that not just intermittently, periodically, it's a long-term historical trend that seems just bound up with the very, unfurling of capitalism itself. So it's not like an accident or a fluke, et cetera, right? And so capitalism has, left, especially thanks to neoliberalism, left to run amok, without much supervision, has produced this situation where over half the world's population has basically nothing, no wealth whatsoever. And, the top percentages at the high end of the 97+% range, and then even within decimal point, divisions within the top 1%, these people control the bulk of the world's resources, assets, and wealth. And then if you ask, okay, if this is what this system produces, it seems actually quite lousy at satisfying human selfishness. Maybe it's really good at satisfying the selfishness of just a few individual human beings, but by its own lights, right? Part of when it defends itself says, it makes selfishness, each person's selfishness work for everyone in terms of creating a greater social good, a rising tide that lifts all boats, et cetera. Everyone ultimately benefits, this kind of classical, capitalist apologetics. But if you look at the reality of what capitalism brings about, it's where 90+% of the world's population has to accept having little to nothing so that just a few people can have a lot. That doesn't seem like it serves selfish, if we just want to talk about selfishness in an ordinary sense, it doesn't seem it serves human selfishness very well. Whereas radically changing both our modes of economically producing as well as the distribution of the fruits of our economic production, right? Which, thanks to capitalism, science, and technology, capitalism itself in its artificial scarcities could be rendered obsolete. And socialism and communism through they're both they're reworking of the mode of production, and of course they're radically redistributive measures in terms of expropriating expropriators. Well, that would promise like the critical mass of humanity a decent material standard of life, probably something approaching what we would associate with like a reasonable middle class existence. And doesn't that seem like, if we want to talk about human selfishness, and if we want to quantify human selfishness, especially at a mass scale population level, that would seem to be a bit, in this way, it's almost as though, all right, if you want to be selfish, you ought to be a communist, not, a capitalist, right? Which is to turn the tables. But another example of this. So, Marx was an avid reader of, the British magazine, The Economist, starting with its founding in 1843. And, I myself, have been a reader of it for decades now. And for me, it's that, it's very thorough news coverage, but of course they're neoliberals. And, I consider it as almost like eavesdropping or spying, right? And it's the bourgeoisie is never so honest as when it thinks it's only talking to itself. And The Economist, they're dismayed by like Trump-style right-wing populism. They want to return to more standard center-right neoliberalism. But when they critique Marxism, which they do quite regularly, right? They are very quick to repeatedly roll out the selfishness objection. Humans by nature are inherently selfish, therefore only a socioeconomic system that harnesses rather than in vain or in total futility tries to reform or revolutionize away that selfishness, that will never work, right? And one thing that's ironic is that in terms of the neoliberal vision of capitalism, that's the ideal of The Economist, I'm hearing my daughter screaming bloody murder in the background, but I know she's with my wife and son, so I don't know what's going on. But if I seem slightly distracted, it's like, okay, what? I'm actually worried that she is going to pull one of those like BBC North Korea expert moments and bomb the interview. But anyhow, but then The Economist, their model is frictionless global capitalism, where there are no tariffs or no trade barriers, where goods and labor in capital as well, can all flow freely across borders anywhere in the world to take advantage of wherever the best economic opportunities are at the time, right? And that for them is the regulative ideal of capitalism. But these are the same people complaining that Marxists have hopelessly unrealistic utopian assumptions about the human capacity for selflessness and self-sacrifice. Yet what The Economists want is essentially demanding is that, like, let's say that you live in the American Rust Belt's a great example of this. Let's say you live in a town that's centered on a big industrial coal mine. And your whole, yourself, your family, your friends, your community, this is part of, this is the economic condition of possibility for your shared way of life there in your town, region, et cetera. And one fine day, the international, the multinational mining corporation says, well, this is no longer profitable for us to be doing this here. We're shutting the mine down and we're going elsewhere to pursue other opportunities. And for The Economist, yeah, fine and good. That's how capitalism is supposed to work. But of course, then the people who are left behind by the multinational corporation they're just expected to say, well, in the name of the abstract greater good of global wealth statistics and the ultimate accumulation of a larger amount of capital in total, I will accept the entire way of life that my family, friends, et cetera, are bound up with to just be ripped out from under us all of a sudden at a moment's notice. And now we have to go seek out job training or go on welfare, et cetera. Oh, and we just have to do this because, this is for the sake of the greater good of abstract growth and accumulation. That seems to me asking a lot in terms of selflessness and self-sacrifice, right? And it's like it's servicing the dark god of capital. Hence my choice of cover image for the book. And so neoliberalism demands at least as much, if not more, self-renunciation, self-sacrifice, etc. And of course, it's also true not only contemporarily, but in historically. I mean, it's no accident that both Weber and before him, even though Weber usually is given the credit for this, Marx, recognized the close connection, at least in early industrial capitalism, between capitalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, English and Dutch Protestantism. And the whole ethos of what Weber calls the Berufsmensch, the man of the calling, involves tightening one's belt, delaying gratification, putting off any enjoyment or satisfaction in terms of self-indulgence, being frugal, et cetera. All of this very self-sacrificial behavior, but all with the aim of it, because of that, eventually, of course, accumulating more thanks to that sort of comportment. But all of these things show that capitalism, neither present nor past, is really about, again, any ordinary type of selfishness that we might be tempted to think of as central to it.
Yeah, and that capitalist fantasy, apropos The Economist, like the tardy fiance of a certain joke that you bring up, capitalism for The Economist never fails, since if it fails, it's no longer capitalism, right?
Right. Yeah. And so it'll be, like the Economist will, have these, tut-tutting lectures, when they get on their soapbox to pronounce their policy recommendations to their readers. That it's, typically this sort of lecturing by them implicitly tries to disguise what are systemic flaws, inherent structural features of a very problematic sort built into capitalism itself in its very essence as a mode of production. And they try to pretend like these are just aberrant phenomena, temporary deviations, minor sins that can be, reformed away, without any major structural change, et cetera. That's very much an illusion, I think, to be combated. And also, I would say, the very far right populism that they bemoan now, I will give them this at least. They hate Trump too. But what they fail to recognize is that a lot of, of course, what really sealed the Electoral College victory for Trump in 2016, and I remember this because I watched it happening and became so depressed, and it was late at night, I just decided to go to bed knowing that it was over. When the old industrial Rust Belt states that usually would swing Democratic started to go to Trump. And at that point, I had a sense it was over, and indeed woke up the next morning to find out he had won. That part of his base, right? This aggrieved, I think rightly angry, but the anger is invariably misdirected at the wrong targets. Yeah. But, these are people left behind by global capitalism. When they rail about the elites, this is some of what they're complaining about. And I went on the websites too for some of the fascist groups that were involved in the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017. And when the reporting was coming out on that, I went and I looked up online the websites of some of these groups in attendance there. And what's really disturbing is they all start out sounding very much like, pro-labor socialists, or even just outright Marxists. But then, of course, invariably, it's not just socialism, it's national socialism. You get all the distorting veering off into, Jews, DEI, woke, et cetera, whatever. But that anger, it comes from those who are, from the economist standpoint, are selfish in that they're not happy accepting, well, it just makes more global economic sense for the masters of the capitalist universe to move your jobs, et cetera, somewhere else. And, if we're all in this for the, in the name of growth at all costs, well, that's your duty to accept the loss of your job, the depopulation of your town, the disappearance of your way of life. And these people say, fuck that, no. Right. Yeah. And that's understandable. That's selfishness pushing back against that, showing that, again, capitalism is demanding from them a self-sacrifice they don't want to make. And Donald Trump is a symptom of their reaction against that, their expression of rage precisely at that proposition, even if they couldn't formulate it for themselves in those terms.
And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on. so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.